Okay, so today's sessions is in continuation of the other series of webinars that we have held on the issue of Ukraine crisis. And we have talked a lot about the consequences of this conflict for the Middle East, the global consequences such as energy security, food security, the geopolitical aspects of the issue, the migration crisis this caused. However, we haven't had a view from Russia and about to see how Russia is viewing all this conflict with regards to the positions and the stances that Europe and the US are taking at the moment, and how, let's say, going back a little bit before the crisis, how the US and the European countries somehow provoked this conflict, and let's find out what were the root causes, and also what is the prospect, what is the future prospect of this conflict, where it is heading, and where do you think it would lead. So I wouldn't talk a lot just because we've had a kind of introduction, and I would give the floor to you and hope that after your talk, we would have some Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you again for having me. But I need to start with that. I'm not in no way an expert on Ukraine or in the post-Soviet space, so I will try to do my best to give you my understanding and focus more on the consequences for the region, for the broader Middle East. Which I think is one of the regions which will be affected most significantly by the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. So I'll try to make my points brief in order to leave more room for Q&A for our discussion further on. So you started to question what are the root causes. Well, I think that's one of the most challenging questions to find those. But in Russia here, the majority of experts and scholars, they start looking at the time of the disintegration of the Soviet Union and the last 30 years. So basically 90s, where the first roots or triggers for that conflict were laid down. And that's not only within the Russia-Ukraine relations itself. I would say it lies in several dimensions. So first, of course, that's Russia-Ukraine relations, not in terms like entities, but I mean, throughout the history of Russia, there's been always kind of a challenging time dealing with Ukraine, because it was a very polarized country very polarized entity, geographically, politically, even ethnically, and religiously. And it was mostly split between the western part, or we can say it's northwest, and southeast. That's the first, and that goes back to history, you know, to 15th, 16th century, when that was the confrontation with the Rzecz Pospolita, the Polish kingdom and Lithuanian kingdom back then. And the second dimension of this confrontation is apparently US-Soviet and then US-Russia, which kind of created an additional stimulus for quite risky escalation. So I would say these two factors are the main driving one. And within this US-Russia confrontation, apparently, we all know, and you can hear it from almost every single expert in Russia, the problems concerning the expansion of NATO eastwards, which has become the one of the main trigger for escalations, which we've witnessing over the last 10 years. On the other hand, I should say that if we look back, it was not 2014 was not the first Maidan, it was the second Maidan. So basically throughout the zeros in Ukraine, it went through a series of changes. The first Maidan, then sort of anti-Maidan, but through the political means, when again the pro-Russian leader was elected. And then 2013-14, when the second Maidan happened, and which has become the milestone in the relations between the two countries, and also for the Ukraine itself, because that led to the secession of Crimea from Ukraine, and the so you can call it separatist or strife for independence from the eastern provinces of Ukraine. I won't discuss or dig into like who was right or wrong, what triggered what in terms of the hostilities in the east. But in Russia today, there are two major groups who views the current conflict through two different approaches. The first group says that which Moscow is doing now should have been done back in 2014, because back then there was more opportunities. Ukraine was less prepared, both economically, militarily, ideologically, and during these 8 years, the Western countries, in particular the United States and the United Kingdom, European countries, did a significant job in all these spheres, basically propping up Ukrainian economy, allowing it to float, training and upgrading Ukrainian military, which has become third or second, most professional and strong in Europe, and also ideologically, when during the last 8 years, that was the central kind of a policy of dehumanization of people of Donbass. So that was a research done by my colleagues from MGIMO, Moscow State University of International Relations, and they studied over several thousands of posts in social media, in media, trying to understand what was the approach towards the population of Donbass. So, and the results were that there was like the policy of dehumanization. So for Ukraine, those areas were important as just land, not people, because they viewed those people as already hostile, already aligned, aliens to them. So that was one of the main kind of narrative from Kiev towards those areas, and quite the opposite from Moscow. One of the major reasons which Russian president claimed for going into Ukraine was to protect the Russian, ethnic Russian and Russian-speaking communities in the east of the country. So that's for kind of briefly on the reasons and views for both sides on what caused that. Now, probably we'll just go to the second dimension of this bilateral confrontation, West or the United States, NATO, and Russia. Also answering to your question, what were the rationale behind US and European policy towards Ukraine and Russia of the recent 10, 20, 30 years. Well, if we look into the development of international relations from the view of like political philosophy, so you see that since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the world has, the system has already been through several stages. The first one was this euphoria of the West and kind of celebration of the victory of liberal capitalist free market economy paradigm, which basically won that battle with socialist socialism, communism, etc., which made the world from bipolar to almost unipolar. And since then, the attempts of the United States, or let's call it the collective West, were to cement and to push this or to crystallize that unipolar Western-centric system of international relations. And today, what we see, or not today even, but over the last, we see exactly the opposite processes which are happening in the world, moving it towards multipolarity. And here, all these new regional formations like CSTO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, BRICS, Eurasian Economic Union, Asian Infrastructure and Development Bank, Chinese Initiative, One Belt, One Road. So all of these initiative and formations, which are happening on the regional or macro-regional level, they started to contribute more and started to drive the current system of international affairs towards more multipolarity, which contradicts the main concept of the West, which goal is to cement the Western-centric system. So this is why today, when we have actually the conflict in Ukraine, of course, it can be, or again, it can be seen on several levels. So first is just it can be seen as a kind of escalation of the within Ukraine with engagement from Russia and actually the West. The West also fights this war in Ukraine, but with the hands of Ukrainians, arming, sending humanitarian aid, billions of dollars in economic assistance. So the first is the internal Ukrainian conflict, and it indicates that this state doesn't look today as a viable state entity which can cope with this crisis. The second is the confrontation between two states, Russia and Ukraine. And the third kind of level is the Russia-West confrontation, because if we forget about the fighting which goes on, which is happening on the ground, we also see two other wars in two other realms. The first is in information. It's a tremendous information warfare waged by both sides towards each other. And the third realm is economic or sanction war, unprecedented sanction pressure, which the West implied on Russia So now Russia is the most sanctioned state. So now we have more sanctions than Iran on ourselves. So, so this war has several dimensions. So military, sanction, economic, and information. And here you may ask, what is the goal of the United States or the West? To be honest, I have no idea because a lot of moves and steps which the US undertook over the last decades don't seem rational. But apparently, one of the main goals is to weaken Russia's economy and undermine its attempts to propagate, to spread, to market, to develop this multipolar approach to the international affairs. Another, the second, not in the importance, but by the sequence, is to demonstrate to anyone who might think to act in the manner like Russia, that the US will, to show that what US can do in terms of the sanction, economic pressure, and basically, I think the main message here is from the United States to China. So that our Chinese colleagues now sitting in China, they're carefully and very closely monitoring every single step taken by the United States in terms of the sanctions, Europeans, what they do, how Moscow reacts, how it affects economy, how it affects industries, trade, everything. Because that's kind of a test for China, because the second or the next victim of this confrontation, if it continues, if there will be no negotiated or if there is no negotiated deal, the next confrontation will go to Southeast Asia. So that's going to be US-China confrontation. That said, I'm transferring to the Middle East and what effects this confrontation has on the region. And here it's important because in your emails you asked one question, how it will affect US and Russia's policies in the region. Well, I don't think that the current conflict can fundamentally change existing approaches of both countries. Even those who have been arguing that the United States pivoting towards Asia, that the Middle East is not important anymore. Of course, the importance of the Middle East as a region, as it was previously over the, since the Second World War until the 2010s, of course, the importance of the region decreased. But if you see, in absolute terms, it increased. But in relative, if we convert this presence of the United States in the region in percentage, you can see that this decrease of importance hadn't been converted into lower presence, economic, military. I mean, it's the same very solid presence in the region. The funding of these overseas contingency operations, which are funded through Pentagon and also through a separate line of budget funding, are not decreasing. They're remaining on the same level, if not increasing. America preserves its presence in all major military bases in the region. In Qatar, where they have Al Udeida base, where they have this regional commander of operations. In Jordan, where their headquarters for, or the hub for the American intelligence and security agencies in Amman. So in general, despite of paying more attention towards Southeast Asia, towards China, America still has a solid footprint and a solid stance in the region. And by no means it allows anyone to argue that, oh, now someone else can come in and take over responsibilities of the Americans. It's a tricky question, because if you ask anyone, even China, I mean, do you want to replace Americans in the Middle East? No. I was talking like a couple of years ago on the Moscow International Security Conference to some Chinese expert, and he said, why would China go and expand its presence in the Middle East? Why should we take care or responsibility for something we didn't create? No one wants to go and replace the United States in the region and to take this responsibility. It's their burden. They did it, so they need to fix it. So you break it, you owe it. So, and you need to fix it. And neither Russia nor China have such desire, will, or even capacity. Why would you spend that much time and resources when you have other problems, you know, in more immediate neighborhood? So that's to say that in no way American presence or American policy in general towards the Middle East will fundamentally change. It already changed fundamentally in only one thing, is that the Middle East ceased to be the strategic area for US energy resources, basically. Since 2008, when shale revolution started to happen in the United States, so over the last 14 years, America has become a major, one of the major exporters of the oil. It ceased imports from the Middle East countries, Saudi Arabia, Emirat, Kuwait, decreased two or threefold. So from that perspective, yes, those countries cease to be that important. But in other areas, it's economic, arms trade, counterterrorism, control over the trade routes, Suez Canal, Bab el-Mandeb Strait, all of those. It's all been there. So that's clear for the United States. It doesn't, this conflict doesn't change or won't have much effect on its approach or policy in the Middle East. For Russia, I'm always arguing, and even before that, I mean, Middle East has never been priority for Russia. And over the last decade, even if we take into account Russia's involvement in Syria, it's still very limited. It's still very marginal, and it still doesn't convert this move into some bigger regional benefits, economic or political. So if we look like for this, in 7 years, yes, Russia changed the tide of war in Syria. It deployed 2 military bases. Number of military personnel, Russian military personnel in Syria doesn't exceed 5,000 people, which is very few. and that cannot help convert your presence in Syria, into like very different or stronger influence in the region at all. Quite oppositely, I would say that perception of Russia's rising influence is happening not because of Russia, but because of the changes within the region, majorly among the Arab states themselves. If we're talking about Arab states, excluding Israel and Iran and Turkey. Because since 2011, when the so-called Arab Spring started, you've seen that Americans didn't back up their old allies, and they didn't come and save bin Ali, they didn't come and save Mubarak, and then other leaders started to question, will the Americans come and save us if we have the same problems in Saudi Arabia, in Jordan, in Qatar, in Emirates, in Kuwait, in Bahrain? And they started to think, well, maybe it's not that wise to rely solely on one partner and one ally. Then another two factors happened. That's 2015 GCPOA, which was struck in the summer, and Russia's involvement into Syria. Plus the drop of oil prices in December 2014, January 2015. And all those factors that they helped to change the regional approach of regional states towards Russia. And when states started to pay more attention to it and started to develop stronger ties. Since then, the economic relations, trade grew quite significantly. I don't remember exact numbers, but over the last 10 years, at least 30 or 40% increase in trade between Russia and the Middle Eastern countries, Arab countries in particular, increased. So today, the conflict in Ukraine so far demonstrates that that approach from the Arab states hasn't been changed. We can see that despite the vote in UN General Assembly and Security Council, when some Arab states voted for those resolutions, de facto, not a single country joined anti-Russian sanctions, didn't join criticism. So, which proves that at least one region, so the Middle East, doesn't fall into this pressure from, of course it is under tremendous pressure from the United States and from the Europeans to join anti-Russian sanctions and anti-Russian policies. But the region has become more sovereign, more independent in its decisions. So basically we witness already formation of one of the poles of multipolar system, which is the Middle East. And within the Middle East, you also have several poles of power: Iran, Turkey, Israel, Saudi Arabia, around which you can see a formation of new trends and new tendencies. So this is to say that it's not about probably Russia's policy in the Middle East. And I don't think this conflict will change Russia's policies because in Syria, I mean, Syria militarily doesn't attract much Russia resources, financial or economic or military. 5,000 military personnel, rotation every 3 or 4 months. I mean, that's not a big burden for a country. If we look into diplomatic activities, since February, since the escalation of the conflict, you could see that already several Middle East leaders visited Moscow and held meetings with Putin, and foreign ministers of almost 12 countries, I think, already visited Moscow. And recently, Sergei Lavrov made a trip to Algeria and Qatar, which again proves that Russia's Middle East policy is not affected by the current conflict in Ukraine. So that's we've covered, touched upon the kind of fundamental approaches or changes which might happen or might not happen. So, and my point is that the conflict in the Middle East doesn't have, for now, much influence on that. If we go now on the lower level, more on the ground level, how this conflict can affect the region from more utilitarian point of view, economically, that impact is quite significant, and that's, I think, my where is my most serious concern lies. If we look at the energy side, well, that's not that big of a deal. Yes, the Europeans want to completely cut their supplies of oil and gas from Russia, which is quite unrealistic to do in a short term. Maybe in a couple of years, 3 years, that's achievable. But what's happening in reality is that there is going to be an adjustment or rearrangement of supply routes, which will increase the price. We already see today is what is the price of a barrel? It's $112 for Brent, for a barrel of Brent, and that rearrangement of routes of supplies will support those prices, which is quite profitable for the oil producing countries of the region. But where it comes to the food security and agricultural security, that's where the most problems lie. A lot of countries depend not solely, but 50%, 30%, 40%, 60% of grain or wheat supplies come from Russia and Ukraine. And today, given that sanctions also hinder navigation of Russian cargo vessels, which deliver those supplies, and given the fact that many of the cargo ships are blocked in the ports, the risk of not delivering those amounts of wheat to the Middle Eastern countries is quite big. I don't believe that Russia will use that tool. It never used that ever, even during the Soviet times when it had such leverage. It will do everything to supply, but that's what Russia can do. But Ukrainian part in that also is quite big. Canada, America, and Europe won't be able to replace all the volumes of missing wheat in the region. And if we look at potential consequences of this shortages in supply for wheat, we can see that there is a very big risk of protests and destabilization. If we look at Egypt, the biggest, the most populated country in the region, it has already a population of 105 million people. Their economy is not that good, and they depend on Russian, Ukrainian agricultural supplies quite heavily, about 60%. And if something happens in Egypt and Egypt gets destabilized, well, I'm even afraid to to think what will happen. Just to give you an idea, look what happened with Europe when Libya, which was only 5 million, 6 million people, what happened to Europe when Libya got destabilized? 20 million Syria got destabilized. What impact it had on the region and on Europe in terms of migrants and in terms of drug trafficking, terrorist trafficking, all of this. And now imagine what will happen to the region and to Europe if 100 million country gets destabilized. That's quite not very pleasant prospects for that. So that's one of the major impacts which this conflict can have on the region. As far as I know, Iran also buys not a lot, but also some share of wheat imports are from Russia. But here, I mean, there is no problem in deliveries because we can do it through Caspian, and there is no sanctions or no blockade here. So the more importantly is how to supply those amounts of agricultural products to North Africa, to the Gulf, because now even Saudi Arabia and UAE spend about $1 billion annually to buy Russian wheat and grain. Yeah, and just to, I mean, you can imagine yourself if such a destabilization happens, that will contribute to the rise. I mean, that will have a domino impact on other regional countries. There will be rise of radicalism again and resurgence of terrorism, ISIS, including. That's gonna be a more volatile environment. So probably I will stop here. It's a lot of materials to discuss, so it's better probably to concentrate on something more in particular rather than, you know, try to embrace something which we cannot physically.
Yes, exactly. It's a topic actually that we could go on talking forever, perhaps. I would like thank you for also responding to questions that we have raised through the email about US goals and also specifically about the goals that you mentioned. What I understood from your talk was that the US is more after creating a kind of work, maintaining the liberal order and also weakening Russia. But there are also some analysis in think tanks, US think tanks, Russian think tanks about regime change in Russia. Mm-hmm. How much do you think that could be in a list of goals that the US might have? Would that be a kind of priority, a long-held goal of the US? Or is it just...
Well, it's a good question, but if we look over the past 20 years, America has, or even more, 25, America in particular has quite a lot of ambitions toward regime changes in multiple countries. And we've seen how that happened and what were the results. I think, well, first of all, no one knows what is happening in American elites' hands, what they really want. But if we consider that they're rational and pragmatic, I don't think you want to change the regime in Russia, because that, I mean, where are the guarantees that you will be able to keep country from sliding into chaos and because that will be a disaster in terms of not only economically, but I mean, how to maintain stability in a country where which has the largest amount of nuclear warheads. You know, it's like it's yeah. So regime change, I don't think that's realistic. So if if we consider that the American leadership is pragmatic and rational. If we acknowledge that they're quite idealistic, it well might be one of their goals. Of course, not through the military means, of course not, but through the economic pressure, sanctions. I mean, look, actually, I mean, Iran here is the very bright example of how Americans are trying to pursue their goals in terms of the pressure. There is, I mean, there were no direct major military clash between US and Iran. And also US, I think, understands it doesn't make sense just, you know, to wage a full-scale war against Iran, because that will turn the entire region into chaos. Not only Iran, but with Iraq, Israel, Gulf countries, Syria, even Turkey. That's going to be disaster. So America doesn't want it, but it pursues it through other means: economic pressure, sanctions. Trying to, you know, undermine the country from within using the opposition groups and other elements which can be helpful in that. So I think I don't see a reason to think that Washington has a different approach to Russia. So I think that's what we can say quite safely, that if they have in mind a regime change, they pursue it through the economic means and sanctions. And now you can see, I mean, it has no difference from how US behaved vis-a-vis Iran over the last already 45 years almost.
Thank you. I was going to ask a follow-up question about the economic sanctions, which you responded that as well. Another point that you mentioned was about the third questions that we have raised about the effects of this conflict on the several regions, including the Middle East, which you completely explained about the Middle East. However, about the Caucasus, which is a region.
Caucasus, yeah. So, well, Caucasus has recently become a lot more potential for destabilization through the recent kind of Turkey as area activities in Karabakh. But the conflict in Ukraine, I don't think will have a major impact on the security in that area. I would rather say that, you know, security in Caucasus and also in the Middle East depends more on the results of whether the JCPOA will be renewed or not. That will have much bigger impact on the overall developments in the region and security, rather than conflict in Ukraine. Yeah.
So this leads us to the other question about the non-proliferation cooperation between US and Russia. We have seen that since the beginning of the crisis, and especially after the war broke out, the negotiations for the revival of JCPOA have been somehow been on hold and there haven't been much progress. And some analysts connect this to the role that Russia was going to play. Some believe that the Ukraine crisis has created a kind of distraction for the US, and it's not, JCPOA is not now a priority for the US. There are different views about this. I would like to know your take on this. How would that affect this impact that we've seen so far? How would this continue from now on, not just with regards to Iran's nuclear negotiations, but also about other aspects of nuclear, non-proliferation cooperation,
right?
Deterrence policy, especially with regards to.
That's a very good question, very important one. I think one of the most important. But that depends on how this confrontation in Ukraine will evolve, how it will develop. So there are several scenarios. The first scenario, not that it's the most realistic, but just number one scenario is that Russia loses for some reason. Ukraine restores its state sovereignty. The West triumphs over this victory, and Russia starts to have internal problems. Maybe there is some change politically, internally, and that will contribute to the cementation, or at least not a speedy fragmentation of this unipolar world. In that case, the arms control question is going to be, on the one hand, more easy to handle because the West will have an upper hand and will have more capacity to pressure and to push. On the other hand, I mean, Russia still has reasons and capacities to oppose, but that will depend on how the internal situation in the country will develop. So the second scenario, if gradually Russia will take over in Ukraine, and which will prove that despite all the Western assistance, arms supply, Ukraine lost, that would contribute to more resolute approach from the West, which will spark more military expenses, more deployment of troops or arms along the borders with Russia, and that won't help negotiations. But it also has several sides here. So first, I mean, it will depend on the political elites who will be in power and whether they will be ready to compromise, and what will be the American approach, because in many ways, as you know, US has quite significant influence and pressure on Europeans. So this fall, according to the majority of experts, Republicans will take over both chambers of the parliament. So both Congress and Senate will be under Republicans' control. That creates less opportunities for JCPOA to be renewed, and also for negotiations between the United States and Russia over all arms control, deterrence, nuclear arms control things, and non-conventional or how's it called, non-nuclear strategic weapons. So in any case, the picture is quite grim because I don't see how Russia and the West can reconcile, because you can call it ideologically ideological difference, but I mean it's, you kind of compare it with like what was during the Cold War. But in a way, if we agree and call also ideology like, you know, multipolarism or unipolarism, you know, so I don't see how it could be reconciled. To be frank, I also don't see how Iran and US can reconcile, because there are fundamental differences in how elites and even people in some way look at the international affairs system, in terms of how what are the main principles which should be um, at the corner of its development. And well, now the conflict is being at this stage that for both sides to reconcile, it will require to agree that they were wrong. I don't see anyone who is ready to acknowledge that. You know, last week Americans passed this bill in the Congress, which gives like over 40 or 45 billion of dollars in arms assistance, humanitarian assistance, and economic assistance. Already over the last half year, America supplied over 15 or 20 billion dollars worth arms and economic aid to Ukraine. How to revert it, how to reconcile this, that's a big question. I sorry, I don't know an answer to it. But what Russia is seeking, I think, in this realm, is to somehow make the US and some European countries to sit together and define like a provisional rules of the game. So of course the world won't change, you know, overnight or in a month or in a year. So now it's in transition. So for this transition, in order not to slide into chaos, you also need some sort of rules which will define relations during this transitional period. So kind of like transitional rules of the game. For now, I also don't see how that's possible. Maybe during, you know, over the fall, that there will be more chances for and rooms for negotiations, because most likely Russia will continue pushing and the Ukrainian economy continues to collapse. And I'm frankly speaking not sure where all these billions of dollars go, because yeah, I've seen a lot of video footage and photo footage of these trains loaded with arms heading to Ukraine, but I have seen no footage of those delivered to Ukraine. I mean, where they are, considering that they're giving $40 billion of aid. Now, the Ukrainian state is not capable of processing such big amounts of money. You know, they don't have much sources to do that. So the country is basically paralyzed. And I would even say that here in Moscow, the decision makers might be even welcoming a move when Poland will act like Turkey in Syria and deploy its peacekeeping forces, basically deploying it to the northwestern part, taking control over that, because the rhetoric is like literally the same. Like if you recall how Erdogan was talking before the first military operation in, it was Euphrates Shield or something in 2016, says, okay, Turkey is hosting like over 3 million refugees. It's our limit. So it's a security challenge for us. Over the last couple of weeks, Poland also started to talk like this, that their capacities to host refugees are capped. And I see no reason why they cannot do the same, just deploy peacekeeping forces to provide security for themselves, for Ukrainians, you know. And then if such thing happens, I think that's going to be a good way how to share or split responsibility for Ukraine. It's kind of like, okay, you guys take that part, we're taking this part. Now that is your burden, it's your headache. This is ours. Let's sit now and talk how we can, how we'll continue to, you know, to live here together. So, but I don't know, when I'm talking with my American colleagues, they're like, they even don't consider such scenarios, saying that it's impossible. Where, I mean, I see no reason why it's not possible. You know, they like to say, oh, it's because it's Europe, it's white people, they look like us. This is why it's impossible. We don't act like people there. I mean, it's not an argument. It's not a reason. Yeah, it smells a little bit of not racist, but chauvinist in terms of you know. Yeah. So yeah, the conflict is quite complicated, and in terms of arms control, disarmament, and nuclear deterrence, that's yeah. I would rather recommend you to invite another speaker who actually focuses on arms control. He could be very valuable expert for you.
Thank you very much. So I wouldn't just want to be the solo speaker here. I would rather move on to the other comments and questions from my colleagues.
Oh yeah, sure. Thank you very much. Actually, I have been trying to ask you a couple of questions, but during the talk, you just forecasted all the questions and you answered beforehand. So lots of them were just left answered. Before I ask one of my colleagues question, there's something that I have raised myself, and I want to share this one with you. We recently, maybe in the last 5 to 10 years, what we have seen was something like the fact that one incentive for a better relationship between Russia and Israel was the fact that Russian presence in Syria stopped actually what the Westerns call the Iranian presence in Syria just to be limited. And now that the Ukraine crisis happened and Russia has to withdraw the forces from the region, from Syria specifically, some believe this has given a kind of just maybe a little insecurity in the region, specifically in Syria, because it's near the border of Israel, and this makes Israel and lots of neighbor countries like Jordan and like even countries in the actually Persian Gulf to be a little worried about the situation in Syria. So I would like you to comment on this, and how much do you think this will last? And given the fact that Russia-Ukraine conflict would probably go on for actually longer than has been expected. So where do you see this future relationship between Russia and Israel?
Yeah, thanks for your question. That's an interesting one. I will address the first part. I'm not sure the reports about Russia withdrawing or decreasing its military presence in Syria are realistic. There is some relocation, repositioning of the forces, which has been happening. I mean, for years. I mean, that's always kind of a talks and negotiations between Russia and Damascus, Russia and Iran on where to deploy here and there, and it depends on a lot of factors. When you say about the Golan Heights, the Quneitra, Sueda governorates, there is, I mean, Russia deployed its military police, I think along 13 or 11 posts across the armistice line on the border with occupied Syrian Golan Heights and Israel. It's military police, and they're there exactly for the reason of to disengage and to reduce the risks of any escalation on that border. As for the relations between Russia and Israel, so what we've witnessed over the last 2 months, so eventually Israel kind of succumbed to the US pressure and joined anti-Russian camp, not in sanctions. I don't think Israel joined any sanctions, but it started to, like, you know, on the level of rhetoric at least, it started to voice its criticism. I don't think that will have a lasting or a big impact on Russia-Israeli coordination on Syria. Not even coordination, but I mean the engagement in or deconfliction. Because recently, if you read about it, Israeli jets were attacked by the air defense systems after they were like coming back to Israel, and that was for the first time in years, which might be interpreted as Russia losing its patience with Israel in regards to its behavior in Syria and with regards to its position on Ukraine. Again, it's I wouldn't view any bilateral relations as a very simplistic partnership which defines by a few factors. It's very multi-vector, multi-factor, multi-dimensional relations, which are based not only on historical ties, the Second World War, and fight against Nazists, and the quarter of the Russian-speaking population in Israel, but also because Russia is an actor in the region, and Israel isn't in the region. And Israel also understands, I mean, it cannot fully rely on the Americans. It should also engage with others. Look what have happened over the last 3 years. Israel struck 4 more peace agreements with Arab countries, like in 3 years. It's unthinkable. No one could think of it like 5 years ago that Israel will have peace agreements with these countries. And no one could expect 10 years ago that, you know, Russia will have like very good partnerships with Khalij, with Gulf states and with Israel. So, of course, there are certain problems and differences in approaches, but it never defined the quality of the relations between Russia and Israel. Look at Russia's relations with Hamas, with Hezbollah, with Iran. I mean, it didn't exclude Russia-Israeli cooperation, and vice versa. Russia's cooperation and the partnership with Israel didn't exclude Russia's engagement with Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, with Hashd al-Sha'bi in Iraq. So with Houthis, well, it's multidimensional thing, a lot of factors, and definitely this conflict has a certain effect, but again, it's not a fundamental. It will become a fundamental when, you know, when Israel will cut diplomatic ties with Russia. But I don't think that's where we are. Where we are, you know, it's more likely to happen with some European states, but still, it's kind of very unlikely scenario. Although, you know, everything is possible.
Okay, thank you very much. There is this question raised by my colleague from the German actually expert program. You kind of answered that question. The question was that if this crisis would lead into a raise in Russia's enthusiasm, or maybe any way of thinking of a military presence in the Persian Gulf or the Oman Sea. Actually, you kind of answered the question, but I want to see if this is possible in future. Russia would think of a military cooperation with any of the allies, just to form, you know, something previously we had in the USSR, or something like a new, actually, joint military cooperation, something like this.
Well, in the Khalij, I don't think it's possible that Russia will try to get a military base. I mean, it already has two in Syria. That's quite enough. And this Russian military facility in Sudan, yeah, it's still not 100% kind of defined whether it will last, because now it's going through the Sudanese parliament, and now all this coup and the volatility in the political volatility in the country, the question is postponed. But yeah, Russia has also a facility, and most likely it will turn into the military base in Sudan, which is also okay. Eritrea might be also an option, because back in Soviet times, Russia used to have a military facility there as well. Egypt, there were a lot of talks over the last years about Russia's having the naval facility on the border with Libya. But that's haven't been realized. So, but talking about Russia deploying or expanding its military presence towards the Gulf, I don't think it's possible. Firstly, I don't think any country would like to see Russia's military bases there, because they already host, you know, American, French, British forces there. Yeah, we all remember also the case of Iran, when back in 2016 or 17, when there was reports that Russia uses Iranian airfields to on its way to Syria, and that was perceived by the Iranian public very negatively, because it's in the Iranian constitution that country cannot be used by any other foreign military in any case. So I don't think that's likely scenario to expect.
Okay, thank you very much. And I would like to read this question from Mr. Aziz Hatamzadeh. He's the director of the U.S. Department. Quotes, given the developments in Ukraine and the current state of Russia's relations with the West, and also the fact that the nuclear talks to revive the JCPOA may fail completely, if Iran is forced to continue its nuclear program, what will be the Russia's policy in this context?
That's a very interesting and super difficult question, because on the one hand, Russia has very clear stance that Iran must not have a nuclear weapon, and it's very easy to explain because Iran is Russian neighbor, and I mean the risk of a country being your neighbor with a nuclear weapon is not what you want to have. So that one side of the thing. From another point of view, Russia really wants the JCPOA to be renewed, because that would help to keep or to establish the precedent for the arms control cause. Because over the last decade or more, this architecture of arms control has been eroded. It's been deteriorated, and if there is no JCPOA and there is no other things, I mean, you have almost nothing to work with. You have no solid framework or architecture for arms control. So that's an important thing. If JCPOA fails and Iran continues its nuclear program, well, I don't think Russia's stance here would be the most important to evaluate. I think the most important will be how Israel and Americans will react and will behave. So it's the risks here are quite high, and I mean, in such consequence or in such environment, I don't see Russia being pushy on Iran on that question, because it would mean like you were siding with with the Americans and with the Europeans towards the approach. But what's important also to mention that Russia always tries to compartmentalize different issues and different topics, and it doesn't mix or throw together different issues. So now with the JCPOA, I mean, regardless of how Ukrainian crisis evolves, regardless of what are the relations between Moscow and Washington, or Moscow and Berlin, or Paris, it continues its work. Diplomats are working, and Russia will continue helping the way it can to reach a compromise. But now, what was that? 2 weeks ago, I think was Josep Borrell. He decided to directly put on Biden's table that proposition to remove ICRG from the SDN terrorist list. So yeah, the risks are there, but yeah, to be frank, it's a very good question, but unfortunately I'm not able to answer it in full. It's hard to forecast. But the risk of JCPOA failing, I mean, I see it quite high. I see it quite high. If nothing happens before the elections, the midterms in the States, that would complicate things even more. And
thank you very much. And
one crisis at once.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, there is Ms. Abolosini. Actually, she raised to ask a question. Yeah, yes, we can hear you. Please unmute yourself and.
Ms. Abolosani, if you would like, you can also share the.
Yes, you can share your video if you
Video.
like. Uh,
She's unmuted, but no sound is coming.
Yeah,
Yes,
we
we
can't hear
cannot
anything
hear
either.
you, Ms. Abolosani.
I think that must be a technical problem or something because we can't hear.
Yeah, so I also have a question to you, if you can answer it. What is the attitude in Iran in terms of like how you see the impact of the ongoing conflict and confrontation between Russia and Ukraine, Russia and the West?
So far, it has had severe impacts in terms of food security. Iran has been directly affected by it. Food prices has gone up for products related to wheat production and
Oil as well.
yes, exactly, oil, sunflower oil, and also there has been so much disappointment from the elite and the Iranian population in talks being on hold, being somehow suspended due to the crisis. Of course, we know that there are different factors involved. There's so much pressure from Israel. There's ongoing conflicts, internal conflicts in U.S. politics, in the Congress, the Senate, among Republicans and Democrats. But of course, it has added a kind of factor to the negotiations not going so fast and smoothly and being more difficult to revive the deal. And so that has had effect, of course, on inflation and other economic situations here. Ms. Abolosani, because since we're in the same, we're at the institute, she's come to ask the question directly.
Okay. Hello, Miriam.
Radi što vidite slušat vas i šurat našem institutu. I ja благодарю вас за презентация. Как раньше вы объяснили ваше мнение очень приятно. Я благодарю вас. У меня есть два вопроса просто сейчас. Накануне спецоперации России на Украине и последних событиях мы видели китайский директор ЦРУ Вильям Бернс, даже больше, чем министр обороны или советники Белого дома по национальной безопасности. Если у вас есть конкретные мнения про Team Biden решающий они принимают решение по российским вопросам или нет?
Okay, if I understood you correctly, so the recent travel activity of William Burns, the CIA director, to the Middle East, what are the topics of their discussions and what is the goal, right, of that?
Now
если у вас четкая оценка про тему президент США, принимающий решение о российским вопросам?
Well, I will answer in English, okay, so that everyone can. So William Burns, you know that he served as an ambassador to Russia, so he's quite knowledgeable about the country. So he's apparently involved into the Russia file too, as well as into the Middle Eastern file, because he also was based in the Middle Eastern countries in the region as an ambassador. And now in the capacity of the CIA director, he is definitely involved in those topics and questions. So it's no coincidence that he recently traveled to Saudi Arabia, to Emirates, to Qatar, exactly to discuss or continue discussions on the topics of, increasing oil output in order to decrease oil prices, and then to sell more oil to Europe so that Europe can cut its oil supplies from Russia. So that's a general understanding of what they're trying to achieve. Yeah, but of course we don't know what exactly they are talking about.
Другой вопрос. В прошлом месяце Соединенные Штаты расширили свои отношения со странами Кавказского региона, особенно с Арменией. Как вы думаете, Америка намерена вернуться в регионе и для балансировать против Турции, Азербайджан или нет? Как вы думаете?
So yeah, well, it's a very good question. I don't think the US wants to get or increase its presence or whatever in the Caucasus region, because if we look into Georgia since 2008 and that conflict and war, now there is much less American involvement there. To balance Turkey, I don't think that's a right way to balance Turkey by America in Armenia. I don't think Armenians also would like to see that. And again, if America decides to increase its presence and influence in the Caucasus, that would not be very much welcomed by Russia, and that would serve as an additional uniting factor for Russia and Turkey, despite of America and Turkey being NATO members. They have a lot of differences and quarrels with each other, and as you remember, America was quite critical about Turkey's support of Azerbaijan and its war in 2020, in the fall of 2020 in Karabakh. So for the moment, I don't see that America can or plans to go and increase its influence in the region. In the future, it might happen. For example, if Azerbaijan and Turkey will decide to go another offensive, another war against Armenia, then that might cause response from the United States.
Большое спасибо.
Да, спасибо вам. Очень сложные вопросы просто. Вы очень хорошие вопросы задаете.
Это понятно.
Thank you very much. I think we have one more question before we end this session from Mr. Hadian, a US program researcher. Mr. Hadian, we can hear you, please.
Greetings, Mr. Khlebnikov. Thank you for your informative presentation. Regarding the rhetoric used by Russian media close to the Kremlin, apparently there's been an increase in resorting to the possibility of using nuclear weapons. I wanted to know, because even the rhetoric is a matter of importance, since the last time WMDs were used, and WMDs are a matter of significant importance in the international arena. This rhetoric, does it have anything to do with the troubles Kremlin is facing in Ukraine? And how serious is the threat of using nuke in Ukraine? And the second question is about what you suggested about a possible partition of Ukraine between Poland and Russia. Apparently, the Americans would not agree to the partition of a sovereign state. But how do you see this possible or coming through?
I'll start with the second question. Thank you, Mr. Khadian, for this very important question. When I talked about partition, I didn't mean like official partition. I mean, it's the same situation with Turkey in Syria. I mean, officially, even Turkey supports sovereignty and territorial integrity of Syria. But de facto, I don't think anyone expects Turkey to leave areas it controls in northern Syria. So by the same design, you know, no one needs to say, okay, we partition this country. It's just, yeah, Poland deploys its peacekeepers into northwestern part. Romania deploys its peacekeeping forces into southern part. Hungary gets this Transcarpathia areas. That's it. That's a peacekeeping operation to secure your to address your security issues, concerns about the refugees flow. So I don't think the official partition is possible. You're right, that's hard to imagine. But Turkey is a NATO member, which did almost the same thing. And I don't see anytime soon Turkey withdrawing from all the areas it controls in Syria. Your first question, can you please repeat it again, or just remind, it was about?
It was regarding the possibility of
the nukes. Yes. Okay, sorry.
Tactical nukes being used in Ukraine.
Yeah, well, to be honest, I don't see. I mean, it's my subjective opinion. I don't see that as a necessary move, because Russia possesses way more powerful non-nuclear conventional weapons. So why would you use like tactical nuclear weapon against like cities or civilian population? I mean, I don't see that. You can rather use other more powerful non-nuclear missiles, which has much bigger power and impact on the infrastructure. So I don't know. You're right that rhetoric is important to analyze about, especially of use of WMDs and nuclear weapons. But repeatedly, Russian leadership mentioned that the only way nukes can be used as a response to the direct security threats. So first, you need to have something which, you know, compromises your security and attacks you, and then you can use you can use your nuclear weapons. But in Russian doctrinal documents, there is, I think there is no mention of first using nukes first. This is why it's more, this rhetoric is more important to give, to address the West, to address the Western audience in terms of that. Make no mistake, if there is going to be a security threat, or there will be something which is unacceptable for us, we can use nukes. So it's more, I would consider it's more deterrent, rhetoric deterrent factor, rather than threatening. Because I don't see, you know, the whole deterrence system of nuclear weapons is based on the mutually guaranteed destruction. So if someone uses nuclear weapons, then it causes the response from the other side, and then you just all go nuclear, and we don't have a world anymore. So it's hard to evaluate, you know, whether there is a provocation or that Americans want to provoke Russia to use nuclear weapons first, then to attack in response. I have no idea, but my personal understanding is that I don't think any party is ready to use nuclear weapons if it's not about their survival. That's at least for Russia. For America, we have an example when the Americans used the nuclear weapons against the population, not being existentially threatened, you know, but just to demonstrate what they can do. So Russia didn't have any kind of history record. So that also a factor.
Thank you. I would like to just end with one really last question, and that is about the deterrence that we talked about just before this question, and that is we are witnessing other kinds of new coalitions between in the West. US is trying to make these coalitions not just with Europeans but also some countries in the Middle East. And these are not in the framework of NATO. We are seeing them as a kind of building of deterrence against Russia, perhaps in the future China. How do you see the prospect of such attempts? Do you think that there would be more of these coalition buildings, and would they be a kind of sign of NATO's weakening, in spite of the fact that many analysts say that after the Ukraine crisis, NATO has been strengthened, and could we see that a kind of fragmentation of that in terms of other forms of coalitions?
Fragmentation of other forms of coalition?
No, fragmentation of NATO. I mean, not being, or let's say deterrence not solely be focused on NATO, being also introduced in new forms and coalitions.
Like I'm sorry to understand. Making new coalitions like the
recent
Middle East NATO, which they wanted to, you know, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Israel, UAE. No.
The recent one that was in Stuttgart, I think there was a kind of meeting in Germany between US and European counterparts, and also a few Middle Eastern countries were present.
I'm not sure if I got it. Еще раз.
Наверно, ви не видели, не в курсе это событие. Министр обороны США и НАТО и другие страны سیدلی Germany ani fateli bude takoj kad воєнні sabiti protiv Rasi takie sabiti bila tam наверное были курсы разговора.
Нет, это я видел. So yeah, I saw that meeting. I just didn't understand the question. So the prospect of some other countries joining, not joining, but like creating the anti-Russian front. Well, you've seen, I mean, and I mentioned the Middle Eastern countries are not ready for that. They won't do that. Europe is already almost entirely in NATO. I don't think any country in Asia or Africa will do that too. So it's I don't see much substance behind it. It's again, as Mr. Hadian said, I mean, rhetoric is very important. We shouldn't underestimate rhetoric. And such summits, declarations, and topics which they discuss, it's also in the first place, it's rhetoric, because it's not always or even rarely anything which is discussed, has become the reality, or becomes reality. So, of course, today NATO has to show its resolute approach, that its unity, how they are united against barbaric Russian aggression towards democratic, liberal Europe and Ukraine. And yeah, I mean, what else they can do?
Yes.
Yeah, and Russia recently, yes, on 16th of May, hosted CSTO summit in Moscow when the leaders of Belarus, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Armenia gathered in Moscow. They discussed also other things, and including, expansion, adding more new members to the CSTO. Now it's more problematic, but in the future, other countries also might join it. Iran, actually, I think, has become the observer, or has plans to become an observer state, or a monitor state within this organization.
Thank you very much, Mr. Khlebnikov. It was a really insightful discussion, and hope that our next discussion will be in presence and
Yeah,
here in Tehran, perhaps in Moscow, and hope that the next topic of discussion wouldn't be about a conflict, would be rather cooperation.
yeah, cooperation, exactly. Yeah, thank you very much for invitation. It's always a pleasure to exchange views, and yeah, I'm also very interested to hear what's your opinions on all of these issues and questions.
We'll make sure to be in contact via email or
Please, yeah.
cooperation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, and
Have a good and productive week ahead. Bye bye.
yes, you too. Thank you. Bye.